Hey folks, Sadesh Gudhari back for another episode of the Cloud Stream. And as you guys probably saw on my latest LinkedIn or tweet or whatnot, we are really lucky today to have Kostas join us. I listen to way too many podcasts and way too many live streaming events. And one of them that caught my ear was Kostas was on for one of the A16Z discussions. And what I thought was really great is the perspective that he brought from real world experience. Kostas, would you give us a little bit of background about what you do at VMware, how you kind of make impact for customers, and what your kind of background is? I think that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sudesh. Really happy to be here. So principal engineer, which is a VP level IC at VMware. I'm the architect for vCenter. I like to say that I approved every spec for vCenter between 6.5 and 7.0U something other. Before that, I was at Zynga, where I spent 4 years building up what we would now call a DevOps function that ran the applications and services and infrastructure for, I don't know, 30 to 40 million DAU. At the time I joined, the company had horrible downtime, horrible issues. By the time I left, we routinely scaled games from a couple thousand DAU to multi-million DAU. We had a cutover of $1 billion property between two data centers in under 30 minutes, with under 30 minutes of downtime. So we had an incident where the whole database crashed, and we had to rebuild from backups, and we did that in less than 12 hours. So we have a long history. I had a long history in running cloud infrastructure, cloud services, and then when I came to VMware, my goal was to go build a hybrid cloud infrastructure, because what I learned at Zynga, and this is like the seminal thing for me, is that building a hybrid cloud isn't that hard. The challenge is finding the right vendor who could do that. And to me, VMware, because they were a hypervisor vendor, was the right vendor, and because they were a well-trusted vendor in the marketplace, because it's very hard to build a hybrid vendor when you don't have either a cloud or physical footprint, in on-prem footprint. And so VMware was the right place to come for me in 2015.
Yeah, and so what was great is, as I was starting to listen to the talk overall was, you were responding about the cost of cloud versus the cost of repatriation during this A16Z chat. And there were a couple of points that I thought were very salient. The first was you had an intimate knowledge of the workloads that Zynga was going to be running, right? You kind of understood what was happening, and you already understood the profile of growth for some of these games. So some of the games I understand like are hits, right? They kind of become runaway hits, and you see the demand skyrocket. Other times, some of them are not, right? But regardless of that, you kind of understood that application profile. Would you share with us a little bit about what were the discussions and decisions that you had to make as you kind of weighed what would live in a premise space, what would be in the cloud, and how was that business case kind of shaped up for your organization when you were going through that process?
Yeah, so just to be fair, at Zynga we kind of were fully on-prem. Then we ran out of capacity. We couldn't buy servers fast enough because we couldn't. We called up AWS, or what was AWS at the time. We asked for a lot of servers, and they started buying servers like mad. Fun story, I met the guy who actually was on the other side of the phone call later on. He decided to go into gaming, and he was telling me that he was running into the situation where he couldn't find parts. Between AWS's growth to support Amazon's business and Zynga's business at that time, simply there weren't enough parts to be found, because the growth was so astonishing. Like nobody had expected to need that many parts. It wasn't that parts couldn't be manufactured, it's when you need that many, you need to do better supply chain management. But that was sort of like just to give you an idea of the scale. So for us, the big challenge was, in the first phase, it was how do we get to the cloud? In the second case, it was once we got to the cloud, we were like, wow, this is really expensive. And we hit this brick wall in our finances after 4 years. A combination of things. One was the Facebook deal, which pricing, which caused us to lose 30% of our gross margins. The other was the business itself went through some struggles. although they're doing very well now. And so we hit this brick wall, and all of a sudden we needed to save money like yesterday.
Yeah.
Right now, the brilliant thing that Kadir Lee had identified early on was that the cost of cloud was cloud was very efficient in terms of getting new servers, but terrible in terms of capital efficiency. Because what happens is that if you have a big pile of cash, right, and you
Yeah.
don't have anything to spend on it, and you're a startup, and you're going like crazy, and you're making money, spending $100 million on building that data center isn't actually as insane as it sounds.
Yeah.
Because later on, when you don't have $100 million, you're not paying it to Amazon.
This is the old buy versus lease problem, right? Is that right? To
Yeah,
simplify it?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like basically by spending $100 million when we had more cash than we knew what to do with, we didn't have to spend cash when we were every penny mattered. So it's like the first important thing. Like, so I don't know what the effect on the how many people we would have laid off, but it would have
Yeah.
been that's a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
The second thing is that one of the things most people who followed the gaming Zynga didn't understand is that the curve for a game doesn't look the popularity of game looks like this,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
But the profitability looks like this,
Ah. So
right?
demand is not directly tied to profitability. Oh, because most of Zynga is in-game monetization. Is that right? Or how does is that is that
Yeah.
yeah.
So in-game so it's in-game monetization. So in-game monetization is really about the way to think about it is, there's a really awesome South Park episode, if anybody wants to read it, where basically they talk about freemium games. And I got that speech literally 2 days before by one of the product managers at Zynga. But basically, the way to think about it is that the freemium part of the game is to find all the people who want to play the game for a
Yep.
very long period of time. And then they play it for an exceptionally long period of time. So, for example, Farmville only shut down when Adobe stopped supporting Flash. So it had been on for 10 years. Now,
Whoa. Yeah.
now look at that. For 10 years, if you owned the servers, it wasn't like that game was growing. It was still playing, it was still going. But for pretty much buying a server once and running it for several years on your own data centers, you're paying nothing in terms of rent and capacity. You're just paying for a bit of power and
Right.
you're making money, right? And so if you think of it as an asset that I'm sweating, why would you rent that?
Right. It's like it is, it makes perfect sense if you're going to go become a farmer to buy the tractor. If you are only going to mow your lawn, once a month, hey, it may make sense to rent the mower. Just depends on your
Right,
use case on that. And
right,
this was
right.
particularly
Yeah.
interesting to me as you got further in. You started in this discussion. You started talking about how companies view leverage from their cloud or premise-based investments. And here, what was really interesting is that I thought you had a unique perspective because you understood the applications and the workload profiles. You started talking
Yeah,
about, Amazon's RAM cost versus network complexity,
all
and
right,
yeah,
yeah.
and so this was interesting. Yeah,
That was actually really interesting. So one of the fun things we had was everybody would come to our team and say, "You guys are twice as expensive as AWS," and we're like, "No, we're not." And basically, the reason we weren't is that the Zynga's games were very memory intensive, right? And so
yeah,
if you go into AWS, you suddenly realize that your network bandwidth. The problem with a game is that it basically makes lots of network connections to lots of things, right? And because of the way our games were built, they needed a lot of memory. We
yeah,
optimized for ease of development over CPU and memory efficiency. So every time you made a network connection, it would pause, right? Waiting for somebody to respond on the other side. So you needed lots of memory because you had lots of threads sitting around a lot of the time, right? So as a result, Amazon was hurting us in two ways. The first was memory prices. Amazon was, I can't speak of it now, but back then,
yeah.
the thing that cost money was memory. We weren't buying
Right,
CPUs, we weren't buying disks, we were buying RAM. The second thing was Amazon's bandwidth was terrible within its data centers. It
right.
had flaky latency, unresponsive latency, so that basically it was forcing us to pay even more. The thing that pushed me off, I was a big fan of AWS until
Yeah,
2012 when 2011, I'd have to go look at the dates. We launched Cityville, and all of a sudden, I have to launch 30% more servers, right? And I'm like going, what the heck? And finally, we discovered that AWS had decided to optimize their business. How did they optimize their business? By replacing Ethernet cards that had X buffers with X over 2 buffers. I don't remember the exact details. What does that do? That causes us to use more of their memory, which is
Right.
extraordinarily expensive. So this is an example of Amazon is making an optimization business to make me pay them more money.
Right.
I remember having the conversation with their executives, and they were like, "We're like, do you understand the problem?" And they're like, "You bought more servers." No.
Right, right. No, they don't. Well, it wasn't. And this, I mean, this is a very good point because I think really what's great about the experience that you had at Zynga is that not only did you have the opportunity to grasp the application profile, you had a key understanding of the user profile and how it interacted with the operational environment and the platform environment, and that allowed you to have
Yeah.
that leverage with a conversation. You asked the question, hey, so you made this optimization for your services and it has impacted my services
Yes.
negatively. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're,
And by
keep
the way,
going.
so the thing that I found fascinating in all of this is, so when we designed our data center, we designed it for for very high bandwidth capacity,
Yeah.
low latency, and we put more memory per server, but reduced the number of reduced the number of CPUs because we knew we did more memory than CPU.
Right.
As a result, Zynga, which was a great engineering organization, was with everything. SRE costs, people costs, data center costs, power costs, cooling costs, the security team costs was half the cost of AWS.
Right. Yep.
And
Because
the thing I got after time again is everybody would tell me the same story.
yeah,
Like did
the optimization that you guys had done with your hardware allowed you to basically run more application on platform than you would
yeah.
if you were commoditized. And I mean, this is ultimately a really interesting point in any decision that you're making in enterprise technology platforms is the commodity pricing going to apply to the use case that you have in mind? And what does it do for day two as well, right? Because day one is also like day one's getting started and putting everything there. Day two is really where a lot of those new costs start to surface because as you're scaling out or as you're operating at scale, this is when the enterprise barriers start to show up that add also incremental costs. And that's to me that's the stuff that really is hard to fathom. And, I don't see a lot of
Right.
organizations that know how to factor that into their decision.
So yeah, and so the trap you always run into is like this whole debate of cloud versus not cloud, multi-cloud repudiation is kind of presented as this binary decision, right? It's kind of like not every there are. As a technologist, I never believed in a single cloud.
Mm.
Right. The word single cloud, I have a blog post, which I call, where I call it the Turing machine trap or something like that, where basically some architect or some industry analyst will declare that everything will be done thusly. Like all software, all technology will work this way.
Yeah.
And I usually go, whenever I see that, I go, oh, should I be buying paper and looking for a job as a computer?
Yeah.
Right? Because like we have such a thing, it's called the Turing machine, right?
Yeah.
and the thing that most people don't realize is that the word computer was the name given to the operator of the Turing machine.
Right.
So last time I checked, the job position of computer doesn't exist. So my point is that this notion that there exists a single solution for everything is absurd. The thing that modern technology, the thing that's changed over the last 10 years is in 2009, buying servers at scale with all the parts at the margins you wanted was hard. And so there was these whole bunch of white box vendors who showed up and started to like, they were going to disrupt Dell Technologies. 10 years later, they didn't. Why? Because Dell Technologies and HPE and others figured out, but in particular Dell, and I admit I am a Dell employee, had figured out how to solve the problem of, we've got all the parts, you tell us what you want, we'll bring it burned in your data center tomorrow. And so when I was at VMware, having come back out to enterprise infrastructure after 6 years, I show up there and we're looking with these white box things, these not white box things, and the white box things would break all the time. It would take days for them to repair. Dell would show up with a rack 4 hours later. If a part broke, they would either show up with a new rack or a new part. Like it was, and we would be back on working. And so the thing is, like, if you know your workload and you want this much memory, that many parts, this many, you go to Dell and you get the server and it arrives the next day. There's not the
Yeah.
level of complexity and difficulty. And the reason I'm saying this is that Amazon says, here's a car, and here's a car that you can buy, and you can have any color you want as long as it's black.
Yep. Yeah.
Right. And if your workload, if you're in the part of the development cycle of your workload where you don't know the capacity, you don't know the performance, you don't, and the biggest problem you have is, how do I make it work? Period. And how do I make, how do I develop it? And is there a business? Yes, the elasticity of cloud makes sense.
Yeah.
But if I know the workload and cogs matter, well, the biggest lever of cogs turns out to be the CPU and memory.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And the components, and there are choices you can make that can radically affect the cost of your physical infrastructure. And that cost of your physical infrastructure at scale represents lots of dollars. And so there's this mythology that people are more expensive than computers. But the thing that I learned at Zynga is that when you have 10,000 servers, the people budget is actually quite small.
Yep.
It's actually the physical infrastructure budget that's huge. And so small marginal changes in the infrastructure resulted in large amounts of dollars that we could reinvest in people, games, etc.
Yeah, what's very interesting about that is that I could see, for instance, how if you're running an insurance company and you're part of the technology department and you're making the choice around commoditization, right? Truly, commoditization may work for you, and that might be the right decision for your organization. However, if you are understanding that you're an insurance company that's now dealing with IoT devices and you're going to be launching a digital platform to run, your organization and maximize revenue for your organization, you may be having a whole different perspective on talent. And I think that's a really good point when you were talking about, running at scale. The talent really matters because the talent's going to be the decision, the difference versus the commoditization of hardware. And with great talent, I think whatever platform you're on, you're going to be able to execute well on it. The other thing I want to get back to is that, a lot of times operations teams are like dealing with this overall problem of risk. And something that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about the Dell like white box issue is operations teams don't mind working with hard technologies or difficult or large scale. It's when they don't work that they mind, right? Because at the end of the day, we're the folks on the line for having to make sure that things work. And that's essentially, I think, one of the great takeaways. Now, there's a couple other things that I wanted to ask you about. I'm curious what your view is now, because we, obviously we referenced this use case back when you were at Zynga, but when teams are having to deal with repatriation and make these decisions around where they're going to put those workloads, this feels like the next frontier for a lot of operations teams now, right? As they're making these decisions about, oh, I'm putting some workloads here, but I don't know if that's the right place. I'm going to have to move this app. How should I think about that? And what is your take on this idea that sometimes a single provider is the ultimate provider? I feel like, back to your, this is not a binary comment.
Man, I love, yeah. So first of all, if you have a single provider, you should your sales rep should be sending you flowers.
Fair, yeah.
Right. I mean, okay. So my favorite story as an engineer was I walk into this room when I was at NetApp, and we're going over this account planning, and I noticed that we could save like 30% of the customer's dollars if we just propose this other technology. And the sales team just looks at me terrified that I might actually say that in the customer meeting. And one of them goes, "Do you like this building?" I go, "Yeah." "Do you like the food we're eating in this room?" He goes, "Yeah." Then you'll shut up and not bring it up.
Right. I mean, having been in enterprise sales for 7 years, I understand that perspective, right? Like, yeah.
Right. And so EMC shows up. So I was working at NetApp. EMC shows up and starts making a pitch for this cheaper infrastructure. Lo and behold, 2 days later, I'm called into the meeting to explain this newfangled technology I was talking about, right? I mean, competition is good everywhere, right? It's good in your It's good in your infrastructure. It's good for you. And as a vendor, As a consumer of infrastructure, you want to have competition in your business. What does that mean? It doesn't mean you want to mix and match things at random, but you want to be thoughtful about how you do it to be able to take advantage. And you don't want to go to a single vendor and say, I'm only doing this. You want to do what is the right thing for my workload? What is the right thing for my business? You want to have the flexibility of change. You don't want, and because here's the deal, the reality is vendors make strategic decisions that suddenly don't align with your business, right?
Yeah.
Your business makes strategic business decisions. There are things that happen in the world. So risk management is about having a plurality of choices.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first, the second thing is, as you look at a workload, to me, it was kind of like 10 years ago, the not cloud and cloud was a very different space, right? And the cloud had this amazing user experience. The not cloud did not, right? Over the last 10 years, I'd say, and especially over the last 5 years, and the market results show themselves, for traditional virtualized workloads, whereas 10 years ago you could have said VMware has got challenges, or we had lots of operational, the progress of the product has been significant. But never mind the software, the hardware stack, right? 10 years ago you're buying fiber channel and servers. Now you're buying HCI. There's Nutanix. There's other vendors like Oxide coming in. The complexity of deploying, buying, installing, racking hardware, installing the software, managing the software lifecycle for traditional workloads is rapidly declining.
Yep.
Right. And to me, this is an example of, hey, on-prem, if I'm doing traditional workloads where I don't need all those newfangled services, I have a lot of choices that dramatically reduce my infrastructure. Now, for modern workloads, that's where things get a little bit more tricky. There you're saying, I want the new services. There you're saying, I don't know I don't understand the properties of this workload. There, that makes sense. But then you have to ask yourself, what technologies do I want to pick? Do I want to go 100% all in and use only AWS? Well, then again, go send flowers to your sales rep. Or do I want to be thoughtful in that, right? Sometimes I want to use the best of breed. And so you start looking at some technologies that are emerging, like, EKS, which is running now everywhere, or Kubernetes, or Snowflake, which runs on all the clouds. You're starting to see technologies that you can pick on a per cloud basis that are vendor specific, that they're AWS technologies, they're technologies that run on AWS. And so I think we all have to internalize that there is no, perfect, correct answer, and that choices that 10 years ago were cloud is easy, on-prem is hard, is not true anymore.
That's true.
It's like, if for traditional workloads, the cloud is not that much easier. It's not like you suddenly don't have an operations team.
Right. That's exactly it. You're going to, one of the comments we hear from our field teams a lot is that no matter where you're going in your journey, right? And I'll say infrastructure compute is a journey, and you will always be on it, because if you're running a workload anywhere, you're going to have to maintain it. And that I think that's kind of key point number one. And then what was interesting is that I think, closing out on the A16Z conversation you had, you started talking about a economical view of the cloud and spending patterns. And I don't think you said this, but I think that Corey might have mentioned this, that of all spend on cloud right now and on AWS, 75% of what they see, and this is like the Duckbill Group's view, right, is still basic compute. It is still that thing that you just mentioned. Hey, it may be better for that basic compute to be on premise and your exotic compute to be out here, right, in the cloud or whatnot. And I think what I want to kind of get from you is a little bit of your thought around the economical view of cloud and spending patterns and the effort it takes to stand up those resources that are relatively simplified. So I think, going back to the question, when we were talking about it, it was really like, if you're going to be making these economical decisions, how do you evaluate them to make sure you're not looking at an apple and an orange, right? And how do you make sure that they are standardized so you can see what that is? And it sounded like you guys had the experience of actually running workloads when you were back at Zynga, so you kind of saw what the cost breakdown was. But talk to me a little bit about that, as a lot of our viewers are making these decisions now.
Yeah. So again, it's kind of like the choice of between a statically typed compiled programming language and a dynamically typed programming language. If you don't know what you're doing, prototype and performance won't matter. then a dynamically typed language makes sense until you figure out what you want to do, and then you probably want to move to something that has better performance characteristics at some point in time, right? You know, every Python program that turned into a success eventually got parts of it rewritten.
Right.
Right. So to me, it's really about that question. It's that rewritten question. The thing that's really important and to internalize as a vendor, as when you're building one of these workloads, is to ask yourself, like, what problem am I trying to solve, right?
Yeah.
And so if the problem I'm trying to solve is I want to go build a brand new, I want to go use all of AWS's services, sure, then that you should go use AWS. The problem
Yep.
is I want to go build an application. You should think about how to architect the application. You should think about the properties of that application. You should decide what services you actually need versus which you don't need. You should figure out what platform as a service layer you want. And then once you've done all of that, you should then look and say, okay, what is the expected growth profile of this application, right? If I'm building an application that's only going to grow to 10 people, you know, elasticity doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If it's only going to run in one physical geolocation, having 500 data centers and 500 world locations doesn't matter.
Nope.
Right? If I'm going to install it once and I never want to have to touch it again, having a server that never goes down, that I control the upgrade cycle, matters. So these are the things that matter, right? You know.
Yeah.
And so that's one aspect. The second aspect is, the reality is that the press's understanding of where we are in terms of cycle of simplicity is a trailing indicator, not a leading indicator, right?
Yeah.
Let me just give you sort of like the basic compute. When people say basic compute, what they really are meaning is a server with some storage, right? It's not entirely.
Right.
When we built our data center at Zynga, the concept of HCI didn't exist.
Right. Yep.
Right, so we had to imagine HCI, we had to design HCI, we had to like invent HCI.
HCI, yeah.
Right. Nowadays, you know, it's like, get me an HCI. You know, you want to buy an HCI server, you can buy them prepackaged, you can buy them on-prem. There's like so many different ways of buying it. Like a large amount of our complexity was basically, how do I get a Nutanix server or a VxRail infrastructure inside of our data centers?
Right. The equivalent.
If that had existed, I mean, it wasn't that much more complicated in terms of a physical footprint, right? And then if you actually look what we were doing, we're running virtual machines.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
yeah.
So and then the other thing to realize is that what we were doing is we were building a data center. Well, back then, 10 years ago, you hired people who knew how to build data centers because it wasn't a boutique skill. I was at VMworld the other day and I met this guy who was, you know, it was very funny. Like everybody else is looking very techy, and these guys are looking like construction people, right? Yeah. They actually were pulling off the whole I'm in construction thing. I go, what do you guys do? He says, we build data centers. I go, really? And apparently there's a firm that will, you know, you want to build a data center, you write them a check, you have a data center, right?
Right.
You know, they understand all the details around all the I mean, the building a data center, it's a building. Right?
Yeah, all that stuff. Yep.
Right. And so it turned out that skill 10 years ago was a boutique skill because people weren't building it all the time. Nowadays, there's firms that will do it. In fact, what these guys claimed, I can't verify, was that they built Amazon's data centers. Basically, Amazon would go to them and say, here's what we need. They'd go build one, right? And so they were branching out to new customers. My point here is, like, we didn't have that. We had to go hire the guy who knew how to build data centers. We had to go figure out how to build the servers. We had to imagine hardware that didn't exist. Nowadays, that's not true. Like the complexity bar has dropped from like here to over here. My wife has a great saying, which she says that, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, cloud was rocket science. Now it's carpentry.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean? When it's rocket science, you're dealing with like, you're
figuring out physics.
I have to figure out what a computer is.
Right. Now you're putting together pieces, right? And that's actually a really elegant thing. There are three things that I wanted to, like, you, first of all, a really great like explanation there. Service design and service management are really important. I go back and I think about the attributes that you identified. You started talking about, well, what is the availability, capacity, and future state demand for the workload, right? Like you started laying those things out, understanding those things in relation to things like, does it need to be super resilient, or does it need to be always available? You know, those classic things that people go to acid and base, that kind of thing. I think that's very important for operations teams. And I think the second point was that you're also going to have developers involved in a lot of these decisions, no matter where you platform. As I think about the up level of that decision around service design and service outcomes for teams. And then the last thing I wanted to talk to you about as we switch away from kind of.
Well, can I just go? One of the things that I always find funny when people tell me about public cloud and cost optimization is reading Facebook's papers on how they save money by redesigning their core services.
Oh, really? Is that out on Facebook's?
Yeah, so Facebook will. So if you read through the lines, what they're doing is they're basically taking something that they use that was open source and they redesign it to be more efficient, more scalable, more performant. Heck, right. They invented a whole new programming language to save money on PHP.
That's hilarious. I mean, well, they have the scale to do that, right? So that makes sense. Yeah.
Right, but my point is like this notion that margins don't matter. Well, they do, even for a company like Facebook, right? And they matter because it. And then the question is, well, Facebook did it. Yes, but guess what? Facebook open sourced that, right? So the fact of the matter is the technologies to make your systems more efficient are being promoted more and more out. And as a result, companies like Zynga, we did not have the bandwidth to do what Facebook was doing because we were earlier in our cycle.
Right.
And so we were taking their open source technologies and optimizing our stack. And my point is that even back then, you could see how companies could leverage the broader ecosystem to optimize the parts of their environments that they wanted so that they could surf a cost curve. And this is what I told Kadir back in the days. Like, dude, in 2009, building our own data centers, doing everything ourselves is the right answer. In 2013, it isn't, right? Yep. And so we should be looking to buy more than build. Like in 2009, we built everything. In 2013, I was like, we should be buying.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the thing that's changing, is that the buy has become realistic now.
Yes.
Whereas before it wasn't. It just wasn't. Right. And the market is showing that, because you can see it from VMware's growth in over the last several years. Basic compute. It's like people for whom the workloads is appropriate just buy more of it because it works and it's easier to do and it's simpler to do. Because what did we invest in? We invested in simplicity of install, upgrade, patch, etc. We continue to invest.
Keeping day two simple, man. I love that, because that is often what gets lost from a skill and talent perspective. So there was some interesting news this week, and this is our news segment part of the show where we talk a little bit about what's in the news. And I will say, even though Amazon said they would never go hybrid cloud, everybody's talking all about the EKS Anywhere release, which they've of course put up on the GitHubs, and they are like very, very loud and proud about this. Since I used to work over in the Tanzu team, I can say we've had a hybrid approach for a very long time, and I trust that it is very solid. I'm interested to hear about your thoughts on this. Right? It's essentially Amazon dipping their toe in the hybrid market.
Well, Amazon tipped their toe in the hybrid market when they installed VMC on AWS.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. I was talking about Kubernetes. Maybe Kubernetes specifically.
Yeah. So Amazon has been fighting. One of the most important things to realize when you think you're the Turing machine, you go through this phase where you think that everybody's going to rewrite all of their software to work on top of your infrastructure. Right. And and early on there are companies which say, yes, we're going to go do it, and we're going to rewrite all of it, and then it's going to be a 3-year journey. And then you meet their operations guy, and he says, well, in year 1 we did 10% of the software. In year 2 we did 12%. This year we're at 13.5%, and we're really concerned about the slowdown.
Right. It gets real hard real quick.
So when you get I'm at home and I have to air the dogs out at 11. That was what you guys saw.
No worries. Yeah.
So EKS. So if you have two choices, you can either tell people their money isn't good, or you can sell them what they want. Right. I mean,
I like this take.
Like you could
that
either
is a
tell
good point.
people, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, your money isn't good for me, right?
Right.
Or you can sell them what they want. Right. I
So
mean,
you,
I think, one of the things I admire about Amazon, and I've admired about them since day zero, is that
yeah,
they will sell. They're obsessed about, if you want to buy something, we'll sell it to you. Right.
right.
EKSA is not about Amazon. That's actually the wrong way to look at it. Amazon. This is about Amazon's customers.
Yep.
Amazon's customers want EKSA. Why do
Yep.
they want EKSA? For all the reasons I just enumerated.
Right.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
there's no. This is not a statement about Amazon being a bold leader. This is a statement of the market shifting over the last 10 years. Amazon being an obsessed, a customer obsessed company,
Company.
like to a level
Yeah.
that I admire. Like,
Yeah.
I look at what they do, and Dell Technologies and Amazon. One of the things I admire both about them is they care so deeply about making sure that the thing you want to buy, they have to sell, right? And I
Yeah.
admire them, and they don't get bigoted about what they want to sell. They don't get opinionated. They're like, you want this, we will sell it to you. And this to me is an example of
Yeah.
it. Of course they're going to do this because that's what the customers want. They have, there was a vendor who built I had a long chat with a Contour architect, the guy who builds the software that does bookings, and he was saying we had this massive physical footprint and we wanted to do some Kubernetes. Well, he's not going to move that entire physical footprint into
Right.
AWS.
Yeah.
He wants Kubernetes there. So if you're Amazon, you have two choices. You either sell Kubernetes over there where they want it, or tell them their money isn't any good.
Yeah. No,
Right?
I think that's a really good point, because you look at the broad portfolio as well. The VMware offers, you can find any way to run your workloads, very similar profile, and that's because customers have demanded, we want it here or we want it there, etc. Right? And
And they want to buy it in different ways. They want to buy it
right, yeah,
with
they
ELAs.
want
They
the
want to buy it
value.
subscription.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot. Yeah.
So the next one that we had was this, and this is a little bit sad, I will say. The Docker is now looking at ways to charge folks for using their container platform, and I think what's a little sad about this one is that they started off with this great vision, and really I look at them. Docker was the Windows version of running a container on your local desktop when you were a developer. It was just simple and easy. Still is. But I wonder a little bit about this, as the orientation that they had taken has suddenly shifted, and this is one of the challenges they face. Any thoughts on that, as they've had to shift to a revenue model?
Well, I worked at Zynga, so shifting revenue models, changing things is hard, and I wish them all the best and all the luck. But it's a lot harder. The more interesting question is, what the hell happened, right?
Yeah, that's also that's really what this is like, how did they get there, right? Like that's a really
Right,
good
and so that yeah, so the way I would frame it is that when I saw Docker in 2015, I was not worried about them.
Yeah.
And the reason I wasn't worried about them is because they were trying to create a sealed abstraction on top of an operating system, right? And so in technical terms, what it means is that it's like Java Run Anywhere, right? They were trying to basically create a Java Run Anywhere execution environment that wasn't at a programming language level, but was at the OS layer. So they were essentially trying to build a meta OS. Historically, that has been an abject failure unless you have a small number of operating systems you need to track. And in the Linux space, that was implausible.
Right.
And if you added Windows, it wasn't going to happen. And it was even more implausible because there existed such a thing. It was called the virtual machine.
Right.
Kubernetes was brilliant. And I've said this to Joe and the team before, is that their key insight was to not create a sealed abstraction.
Right.
So they added just enough abstraction on top of the container process, such that you can have containers that are running like in Fargate. You can have VMware native containers. There's lots of different choices. You have Kubernetes running on Windows, and you have Kubernetes. So to me, it's like picking the right abstraction, picking what you're trying to accomplish. And so essentially, Docker said we're going to compete with the entire industry. The second thing that Docker did was that they were going to compete with a very large industry. Whereas Kubernetes said, we're going to be open and build a community and get everybody involved and get everybody engaged, and everybody's going to be able to make money off of this thing, rather than we're going to try to suck the value out of everybody.
Yeah.
As a as a result, the Docker strategy, which was just not, in my opinion, viable. It relied on it basically depended on VMware completely misexecuting for years. And like since I joined VMware, I had my opinions on the topic.
Yeah.
But I just never thought it was a viable path forward. Now, Docker Swarm, had architectural flaws in it around how it treated state, and which again reflected this bias that they had. And so, in the end, their attempt to build this stable and server backend died when Kubernetes came out and the community moved there. And now they're trying to get into developer tools. Developer tools is a hard business. It's a very, very hard business.
Very
My
political.
experience, but it's not even just political. It's the challenge you have to see is like, what I learned is the real win in developer tools is when you get to the point where you dramatically simplify some technology to the point where so the level of expertise declines by a factor of 10. So for example, Flash made somebody who didn't know how to program the ability to program 2D animations, right?
Right.
So that's an example of the kinds of developer tools that are successful. I like to joke that VMware is a little bit like the Adobe infrastructure, and that we take all this complicated infrastructure and we make it easy for operations teams who understand their business really well, understand their operational needs very well, and rely on us to understand how to make the technology work in there and to respond when things break. Those are the kinds of tools that are successful. Unfortunately, I can't comment, or we don't have an opinion on whether Docker is going to be successful. I wish them all the best. And it's always a change. When you have to go from one business model to another, people get annoyed. And going back to my original story, this is why when you're dealing with your infrastructure, you want to have some flexibility, because the other guy makes choices as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Whoever you're buying from. Yeah. Now, we're coming to the end of our time, but I did want to mention that my favorite tweet of the week was one that compared AWS EC2 egress data pricing to the cost of internet access around the world. And as it turns out, it is more expensive than the most expensive internet access, which happens to be in Israel. I really loved that tweet because it made me laugh out loud. And so I wanted to share that. And the last thing I wanted to kind of mention was DigitalOcean, who is really kind of focused on the developer market, has acquired Nimbella for multi-cloud serverless deployments. And as a reinforcing function, I just see this as more, similar to why AWS is, releasing EKS, more kind of making this a real thing that's kind of happening in the marketplace. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm sorry. I was gonna go sing a song, right? The Hotel California song. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Welcome to the Hotel California. Right?
I like it. I like it a lot.
Right? It's like, right. This is a great example of how a vendor arranges its pricing to optimize their business, not yours, right?
Yep.
And so, this is what I mean by they're not in the business of making money for Amazon, as they should be. They're not in the business of making money for you. Your job is to take care of your business. My grandfather, great true story. My grandfather was in IT, part of the original digital transformation from handwritten accounts in the Eastern Mediterranean to computers.
Okay.
Right.
Wow. That's
so I'm a third generation IT guy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he goes once. He had this business deal that went south, and I go to him, what happened? He goes, I'll say it in Greek. Αυτός πρόσεχε το διάφορο και εμείς όχι, which meant he was paying attention of his interests and we weren't. So my point is, if in business, you have to pay attention to your interests and not rely on the kindness of the other. And so in the early days of cloud, where AWS was only a game in town, it was easy. You didn't have any. It was an easy choice. We're in a harder place. We're in a harder world because you have more choices. But the more choices give you more flexibility and opportunity. And the businesses that take advantage of those will have capital, will have cash, and they'll be able to invest and grow in the areas that they want. Because spending money on a server, as I was telling somebody, is like, you might as well take the money and burn it.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
it doesn't add any money to you. It doesn't grow your business. Spending money on software grows your business. Spending money
Right.
on your customer grows your business. Spending money on a server, on a compute cycle, it burns your business. So what you want to do is figure out a way in which you're not keep feeding this fire, right? And so
Yeah.
when you buy hardware, you're not feeding the fire, right?
Yeah.
And so
I
this to me is like,
love that.
this to me is why I think, you know, you have to manage your business carefully. You have to think about your costs. You have to think about your architecture, think about your challenges, think about what problems you're trying to solve, and then pick the right technology choices. And realize that you're not going to pick one. You may pick one to begin with, but over time things will change, right? Things will
Yeah.
evolve, and if you keep that in your head, you can now pick technologies that make it easier to evolve. And that's what EKSA is about. It's about picking technologies that make it easy. That's what Tanzu is about. That's what Novella is about. Everybody who's building infrastructure knows that this is what customers want, because that's why they're buying these companies. They realize it. That's what the demand is.
Yeah.
And why are customers wanting this? Because they see it can be done. But
Yeah.
like the biggest mystery in my life is like, why for 10 years when we had a hybrid cloud at Zynga, everybody was telling me it was hard.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's it. So Kostas, I wanted to thank you for coming on and really enjoyed this conversation. Look forward to having you back after VMworld. I know there will be a lot of stuff going on there. And I really appreciate you getting up early. I know it gets a little hairy. And thanks again.
Yeah.
Take care. And
Thank you.
Hope
Thank you.
to see you soon.
It was great. It was great being here. And you'll notice the Tanzu.
I like it.